It's part of the famous members' banking way in the 30s, cars would corner at well over 100 miles an hour. But more of what made Brooklands great later on in the programme. We start tonight with a more modern motor racing success story, Cosworth. The name Cosworth is famous throughout the world of motor racing. Their engines are carried in Indianapolis cars and in Formula One racing machines all over the world. More recently, they've been using their expertise to develop engines for road cars like this Mercedes 190 and this Ford Sierra Cosworth. Now, recently, Ford have come out with a more toned-down version of the Sierra Cosworth. We sent Chris Goffey to test it and to report on the engineering success story that is Cosworth.
Can you take care of it? They got a hot one for you. Can you take care of it?
If you're in the mood for burning rubber on an airfield circuit, you can't beat Ford's new Sierra Cosworth. It's a more civilized machine than the old model, with much more restrained exterior styling. Only those sports wheels give the suggestion of high performance to come. At the heart of this apparently innocuous-looking car is this extraordinary power unit. It's basically the Sierra 2-litre cast-iron block, but that's about the only component that's common with a normal Sierra. On top of it, the Cosworth Engineering cylinder head, twin overhead camshafts, 16 valves, 4 per cylinder, and they've turbocharged it as well, and that's enough to give it 204 brake horsepower at 6,000 RPM, and that's almost double what you'll get out of a standard 2-litre Sierra. The new Cosworth is all too easy to drive at speeds way beyond those safe on public roads, but it's noisier than some of its rivals, with transmission harshness and that magic roar from the engine. Make no mistake, this is real performance. 0 to 60 in around 6 seconds and a maximum speed of 150 miles an hour. It's quicker than a BMW M3 and it's only slightly slower than the mighty V12 engine Jaguar XJS. And the power is instantly available. There's no turbo lag. You simply plant your foot flat on the floor and the car really flies. The new suspension makes the car ride more softly and gives the driver fewer nervous moments. It feels more stable and forgiving, and it doesn't weave around on the road like the old car. Less impressive is the interior, which is identical to an ordinary Sierra's, except for the Recaro seats, which are very supportive. At £19,000, the Cosworth is good value for its supercar performance, and the Cosworth name should help Ford boost the image of both Sierra and Sapphire. The association between Ford and Cosworth isn't new. It goes back over 20 years. The DFV, standing for double 4-valve, was the first important engine to be built by Cosworth back in the 1960s. Commissioned by Ford and installed in the Lotus 49, it aimed to give Ford an entry into Formula One. And its first time out, in the 1967 Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort, it scored a notable victory for Jim Clark in the Lotus, and the engine dominated that season's Grand Prix racing. Years later, after over 150 Grand Prix wins, a derivative of the engine, the DFX, was still winning races, this time for Al Unser in last year's Indianapolis 500. At their Northampton factory, Cosworth attribute their success to meticulous quality control. They make as many engine components as possible themselves, right down to casting their own pistons.
We started manufacturing pieces because we couldn't buy them out made sufficiently well, and therefore decided that we should make them. We tended to think there was no point in designing something that might be good if it wasn't made sufficiently well to demonstrate it. Therefore, we started on making everything to very close tolerances so that all pieces were interchangeable, so that just about anybody could rebuild an engine. And therefore, the engines became popular because all kinds of people could rebuild them.
An example of Cosworth's ingenuity and attention to detail are these tiny torsion bars built from ultra-high tensile and ultra-expensive steel. Soon after the company launched their DFV racing engine, they discovered that the savage torque reversals of a racing engine was causing wear and ultimately highly expensive failure in the complicated gear train that drives the camshafts. So they used these tiny bars to transfer power from one set of gears to another. There's just enough twisting motion, within strictly controlled limits, of course, to cushion the snap forces as a racing engine goes up and down through its 12,000 RPM rev range. But not all Cosworth projects have been successful. When turbos came to Formula One, Cosworth designed a new engine for Ford and installed it in the Beatrice car for the '86 season. It failed dismally. So what went wrong?
I think the previous turbo formula, which arrived up with using very special fuels, little resemblance to petrol, allowed you to run engines that bore little resemblance to those that you could put in a car. I obviously have some liking for fuel economy formulas, but feel that drivers need to be high-speed, totally flat-out drivers and not watching fuel gauges.
The company's built a new factory at Wellingborough to develop its road car engine business. Highly automated machines have been installed to produce engines for motor manufacturers like Ford and Mercedes, and it's rumoured General Motors, who want specialist sporting versions of their cars. But while road cars now form the bulk of the company's business, they're developing a new range of racing engines for Formula One.
Well, the rules have changed so that the turbo engine is going to be entirely banned after the end of 1988. And we go back to a 3.5-litre normally aspirated formula. This means that we are back to the old game which we were so successful at with the DFV. And what we have done is to do a series of developments using the DFV as a base, and we are playing around comparing the outputs of 5 valves per cylinder with 4 valves per cylinder and various other modifications before we introduce a totally new engine for Formula One.
Well, the experimental version of that new Cosworth engine had its first outing in anger last week at the Rio Grand Prix. It didn't win, but it was the first of the non-turbocharged cars, with Boutsen and the Benetton car finishing 7th. All a far cry, of course, from Brooklands in its heyday in the 20s and 30s. In 1932, for example, a cousin of this 1398 Vauxhall won the Gold Star Handicap, lapping at over 115 miles an hour in front of a crowd of many thousands of people. All that sadly is long gone. All that remains is the clubhouse behind me and part of the banking. But there are plans very much alive to restore part of the circuit and to open a museum. After 50 years of dereliction, is it worth it? Well, obviously the enthusiasts think so, but Tiffany Dale has been exploring the continuing legend, that is, Brooklands.
Right from the start of its construction in 1906, the steep banking was Brooklands' most noticeable feature. It took 200,000 tonnes of concrete to make, and the River Wey had to be diverted in 2 places. It was completed in June 1907, after landowner Hugh Lock King had invested £150,000 into building the motorcourse.
Brooklands was an instant success. It attracted cars from all over the world and was the proving ground for high-speed cars and record-breaking attempts. With a speed limit outside of only 20 miles an hour, it enabled man's quest for speed to grow. I'm driving around the remaining section of the members' banking in a car that's typical of the early years of the circuit. This is a 1914 4.5-litre Renault 28 horsepower ED, and it's capable of lapping the outer circuit at 80 miles an hour.
And it wasn't just men who came under starters' orders either. Women picked up the racing bug too, and with their added glamour, Brooklands grew in popularity. During the 20s and 30s, motor racing became a thriving social event enjoyed by all.
You used to get tremendous crowds on the test hill back there. They used to come in their thousands for the race days themselves and also on practice. It was a great place for all the family. The kids would come along in their thousands. They'd all have picnics along the Members Hill there. You'd see them thick as flies, but it was always a lovely crowd, great crowd, no crowding, which was indeed Brooklands' motto, the right crowd and no crowding.
Besides motor racing, Brooklands also had aviation links. From its very beginning, pioneers such as Tommy Sopwith and A.V. Rowe made it their home. Adjacent to the finishing straight was the test hill, where cars and motorbikes had both their brakes and accelerating capabilities tried out. The record for the fastest ascent to the test hill was set back in 1932 by R.G.J. Nash. Driving his Fraser Nash from a standing start, he climbed the hill in 7.45 seconds, and that's a record that still stands today. Unfortunately, some of the earlier bikes, such as this 1914 TT Aerial, were unable to make it to the top without a touch of human help. The top of the hill also gave spectators an excellent viewing point of the circuit, from the members' banking all the way around to the Byfleet banking in the distance. But now there's also a closed aircraft factory and an industrial estate. The banking was always Brooklands' main landmark, but with cars hurtling around close to the top, it required tremendous driving skill to get round.
In the early days, with fast motor cars, small tyres and things like that, it was not quite so easy. Small cars sometimes tended to ride much too high on the banking, and with a fast car coming around on the top of the banking, it was very difficult then to get past.
Sometimes the inevitable happened. Brooklands was famous for many things: its banking, its social scene, its atmosphere. But the racing car that everyone associates with Brooklands is the Napier Railton. Built for John Cobb here at Brooklands by Thompson and Taylor, the 24-litre, 12-cylinder Napier Aero engine gave 600 horsepower. It broke many records, but it left the final mark of an average of 143.44 miles an hour around the banked outer circuit. The Napier Railton now lives up in Shropshire at the Midland Motor Museum. Its racing career finished with the outbreak of World War II, which also brought to a close this first home of motor racing.
And for fully 49 years, that was really the end of the Brooklands story. But now the Brooklands Museum Trust is set to raise £10 million to restore much of the site, starting with a major fundraising event in June of this year. They've already restored, as you can see, the marvellous old clubhouse. They're setting out to raise collections of some of the best cars that raced here and some of the aeroplanes that took off from the airfield here, including a replica of Avi Rowe's biplane that first hopped off the ground here 80 years ago. They're also going to restore some of the best parts of the track to form a small circuit. So if you want to learn more about this appeal, please write us at Top Gear and we'll pass you later on. I'll give you the address in a minute or two. Now for a complete change of gear, if you'll pardon the pun, the Peugeot 405. Car of the year, made in this country at Brighton near Coventry, about to come out as a diesel version. Frank Page has been looking at the pros and cons of owning a diesel in this country.
Diesel engine cars are zooming up the sales